The recent Paralympic Games have proven that physical challenges cannot limit human spirit, or that people with disability need is opportunity and accessibility, an area where India is often found wanting. Lack of ramps in public places is just one glaring example of this. However, the challenge becomes even more acute when access becomes difficult at hospitals. Marinau's Nikhil brings us a special ground report for more. Take a look.
Many a times, people simply accept apathy as an unchangeable reality, more so if they have battled misfortunes, losses, or physical challenges in life. But Dr. Satyendra Singh is not such a person. He was not going to let administrative apathy pass. He sought accountability and made the system take note.
None of the medical institutions in the country were disabled friendly. So I filed this in 2013. There was an order issued from the Medical Council of India, but there was a very poor compliance. Because of that, I filed a second petition with National Human Rights Commissions. They disposed of the case after 3 years, but by saying that it is now the responsibility of the dean or principal of the medical institution that that place needs to be accessible.
Following Dr. Singh's complaint, the Office of the Chief Commissioner for Persons with Disability recently issued a notice to some of the premier healthcare institutions in the capital, including Safdarjung, Lady Hardinge, and the RML hospitals, for failing to provide adequate infrastructure for people with disability. We at Mirror Now are committed to not let this be a mere academic exercise. We want those in corridors of power to see the faces of people who are denied equity, opportunity, and dignity because of poor planning and apathy.
When I went there and I asked for any accessible washroom, then they simply denied and said that in this whole building, which is almost of about 4 to 5 floors, there was not even a single accessible washroom. And all the washrooms which were there were very, very small, and they had 1 or 2 steps in front of them. So this was quite tragic or traumatic for me.
When Mirror Now visited these premier hospitals, which had been served the notice, the sight before us was a sorry one.
So this is the picture which we are showing you from outside the OPD department of Safdarjung Hospital. A slope can be seen here which can be used by the people either with persons with disability or the toddlers or the elderly as well. Apart from it, there is separate parking facility which has been provided by the hospital for the persons with disability. But what we did not see inside the OPD building is about the separate washroom facility for those kind of people. Apart from it, there is no separate queue for the people who are seeking appointment for the OPD facility. So these are the two major factors which we did not find at the Safdarjung healthcare facility here in the capital city.
The Ministry of Health and Family Welfare issued a Gazette notification in 2023 highlighting the criteria of accessible infrastructure, including the distance of pickup drop points from the main building and the specification of the ramps to be built for access. Not just that, the notification also highlights the specifications for separate accessible washrooms, lifts, common areas for people with disabilities. While sites at some of these major hospitals is depressing, there are other institutions in the city which have rightfully shown the way. And people like Rajiv Virad showed us how, with the right approach, public infrastructure can be developed in a way that disability does not turn into inability to access.
I think the bare minimum should be that the surface has to be even. It should not have any cobblestones and all. It should have decent, ramps, wider entrances, access to toilet, access to all the basic amenities. I mean, I should not be denied entering any area just because of my disability.
The notice issued by the Commissioner for Disability had sought a response from these hospitals in 15 days. That deadline shall get over shortly. And in case there is no visible change on ground, Mirror Now will return to these centers and demand answers, ensure that the differently abled get their due. With Nikhil Lalwani, Mirror Now report.
Now, in 2015, the Government of India started an Accessible India campaign for achieving universal accessibility for persons with disabilities. But yet, there's inaccessible public transportation, social stigma, and more. In fact, earlier this year, a Supreme Court report had exposed gaps in accessibility at courts across the country. And the picture doesn't begin and end with hospitals and courts. We have Nipun Malhotra, a disability rights activist, and Urvashi Prasad, the former director of NITI Aayog, joining us for a discussion on disability. Thank you so much for joining us, taking out the time to have this very important discussion. Mr. Malhotra, I'd like to begin with you. How inclusive is this country for people with disabilities? Would you be able to talk about the problems, the lack of access that is faced on a daily basis?
Sure. I think your video, which you showed before this discussion, actually showed how inclusive India is, unfortunately, for persons with disabilities. Because if healthcare itself is not accessible, I don't know how the rest of the country can be accessible in that sense. And that is ironic coming in a year when India has won 29 Paralympic medals. The country has been celebrating our Paralympians. But, we cannot have it one way where we are celebrating people who are achieving despite their disability, but not giving the basic infrastructure that is really required to persons with disabilities in that sense. And mind you, the Ministry of Health, I'm glad you're covering this story because I think the Ministry of Health has consistently been ignoring disability in that sense. The National Family Health Service 6, which came out a couple of years back, actually eliminated questions on disability, which were there earlier on disability as well. Accessibility continues to be a big challenge, not just in hospitals, but in all public infrastructure. But one would think that it's most important in hospitals. And more than that, I think it's not just about accessibility, it's about sensitization as well. Doctors are not sensitized on how to interact with persons with disabilities. I remember when I was born, my parents were actually told that Nipun is going to live the life of a wooden doll. And this was by medical doctors telling my parents that. So I think we need more sensitivity, we need more infrastructure change, and both need to really go together for this country to change when it comes to persons with disabilities.
Absolutely. Well said. Do stay with us. Ms. Prasad, want to come across to you now. How much of a focus is there on making public spaces more accessible? You are a former director of NITI Aayog. You would be able to have a lot of experience in connection with this. So let us know what the truth actually is.
So, what I would say is that a lot of progress has been made on paper. If you look at the legislation, whether it's the Disability Act, whether it is different policies, standards, frameworks, even for, health facilities, you already have the public health standards in place, you have the quality assurance standards. So on paper, we do fairly well. Where we really lag behind is the actual implementation in trying to take these policies, these legislations to the ground. And I think that happens for 2-3 reasons. Quickly, I will just mention in this case. One, I think, of course, there is a complexity of our, administrative system, our political system. We have the center state complexity, where the center is funding, some part of these facilities, but then the actual implementation is happening at the state level. So one is all of those issues. But I think the second issue is more of intent. And I think, as Nipun mentioned, that there is still a lot of apathy, in society in general. And ultimately, if you look at people in government or people in private sector, anywhere, we're all coming from the same society. And if there is apathy, if this issue is not considered a priority, if it is not considered as important, then always, any administrator of a hospital or anybody who is trying to implement these guidelines will say, okay, this is not a priority, I'll do this later. I'll do other things first. So I think at the root cause of it, because the same administration, when we want to do things, whether it's large scale vaccination programs, whether it's elections, we do it, and we usually do it pretty smoothly. But that's when I think we have the intent and the will. In this case, I think somewhere that intent, that will also needs to be increased. And finally, I think the third point I would say is the monitoring and the accountability. When you have the quality assurance being done of health facilities, the accessibility aspect has to be looked at, and it has to be seen that is it only a tick in the box, or is it actually being implemented in these facilities? And that has to be
Absolutely.
enforced. So I'll just, very quick example to give you what I mean by the difference between the two. In most government
Of course.
institutions now, you'll find that there will be a separate parking spot, for the differently able, but you will find that almost always it's occupied by somebody who shouldn't be there. So that's what I mean. But if I go with a
Okay.
checklist, the box will be ticked that yes, there is a parking spot for the differently able, but actually when you'll go there, you'll find that actually it's
Exactly.
always occupied. So that's the gap that needs to be bridged.
I think that's a very important point that you're raising there. The fact that even though there are measures and action, some action that is taken on the ground to make places more accessible, it's more about just ticking a box. Mr. Malhotra, I want to come back to you. We were just talking about, Ms. Prasad actually just spoke about the Rights of Persons with Disabilities Act just a little short while ago. I want to go through that with you, where it's about the right to equality, dignity, integrity, equal opportunities to disabled people, all public buildings be made accessible. This was an act that was brought in 2016. How much of this rings valid today? Do you think that all public buildings are accessible?
No, and I think Ms. Urvashi Prasad actually made a good point when she spoke about the fact that things are there on paper, but they're not being implemented. I would take it one step further by saying that there is also a big lack of harmonization of laws in India, and let me explain how. The Rights of Persons with Disabilities Act
Okay.
2016 actually said that in 5 years, all public buildings are going to be made accessible. It actually, in its rules, also listed down very strong guidelines which need to be followed when it comes to accessibility in that sense. But at the same time, building bylaws, which are made by states, have not really incorporated any of these guidelines. So a building today can get a completion certificate if it's not really accessible, but I can take it to court tomorrow saying that it's not violating the RPWD Act in that sense. And I think that is really the irony of the situation here today. And that is why it's unfortunate and it's exhausting that people like Dr. Satyendra Singh and other disability rights activists have to always go to various courts, fight cases, etc., to really fight for the basic rights, which is to enter a particular building. Uh, I mean, why do we really need to go to the courts for everything in that sense when this law is there on paper? That is because of poor implementation in that sense. Urvashi also mentioned accessible parking, disability friendly parking. The joke in the disability sector is that, it's not disability parking, but it's VIP parking. Because what often happens is that the biggest VIP in any public building that we go to has his or her car parked generally in the disability parking spot. And the disability parking spot is not really visible to people with
Okay.
disabilities. So on the surface level, I think we have moved ahead in that sense. But on ground, there's a lot more that really needs to be done.
Okay, speaking about what more needs to be done, Ms. Prasad, coming back to you now, what exactly is the plan for an accessible India? How much is done even on a rural basis? We're talking about urban landscape at this point, but rurally, how much is done?
Yeah, I think rural has even more challenges in many ways. And when I'm talking of health facilities, I'm talking of everything. Right from health centers to district hospitals to other types of health facilities. And I think we're grappling there to meet even the basic standards. In fact, just a couple of months ago, the government had come out with a self-assessment, in a way of its public health facilities, and hardly 20% were even meeting the basic, Indian public health standard norms. And those are very basic. Just basic medication, basic manpower, basic infrastructure. So, if we are not even meeting those right now, you can imagine that, some of the people there, they almost feel like if we were to have a ramp or we were to have a toilet for the disabled, it would almost be like a luxury, because we're not even doing the absolute basics that we were supposed to do in those health facilities. So I think the challenge is enormous. And that's why I always said that, it's not enough to bring things on paper. We have to get them on the ground. And I think one of the ways in which it could be expedited or, could be done better, I think, is if we could involve, people with disabilities themselves or people who have experience of what should really be prioritized. Because if you look at some of our guidelines, we have a lot of things mentioned there that you should be doing X, Y, Z. Pretty much everything is mentioned. And sometimes I think what happens is that when somebody's looking at it at a facility level, it's so overwhelming that they actually end up doing nothing at all. And so I think if we can actually involve people with disabilities who can say, okay, these 5, 10 are absolute essentials, non-negotiables, then we go to another 10 things that you need to do, and then after that. So I think we need some prioritization wherein every single facility we commit in the country that we will at least have these 5 or 10 things which are absolute essentials, whether it be the ramps, whether it be the toilets, whatever it might be. That's why I said it's people with disabilities themselves who can best tell us this, and ensure that in a short time frame we at least have that much, and then move from there. So I think this could be a way of getting it to work better, because a lot of the times people implementing the policies are people who have no experience themselves of these issues.
But so then, are these discussions being had at the grassroots level when we're talking about, because NITI Aayog is, of course, the foremost think tank organization of the government, are these discussions being had?
Yes, I mean, NITI Aayog is a policy think tank, so we do have these discussions. But like I said, we've also written a lot of these things in our documents. They are there in a lot of the strategies and a lot of the plans that we put forward. But like I said, that until we can get it on the ground, the discussions and the documents are not meaningful, and that is why I feel that it's good to have a whole host of things you want to do, but given the reality, the ground reality of where we are today with most of our health facilities, and you spoke of rural areas where you might just find almost nothing there in some of the facilities, we at least need to come down to a list of absolute essential immediate priorities that we do, and we have a fixed time frame to it, we have a fixed accountability, a monitoring of what's happening. Because I think until that happens, it will just remain a conversation, or it will remain something on paper.
All right, very important points that you're making. Mr. Malhotra, coming to you next. What is your perspective on how well-versed the general public is? Is there a lot of discrimination that is faced by those with disabilities?
Before answering that question, I just want to touch upon one more point which Urvashi raised about inclusion of persons with disabilities in decision making.
Of course.
You'd be shocked to know that in the 2024 Lok Sabha elections, across political parties, there was just one candidate with a disability who contested the election. And you'll be even more shocked to know that not a single leading national party in India today has a disability cell. We have cells for various minorities, whether they're caste-based minorities, religion-based minorities, etc. But people just don't realize that disability is a big vote bank too. It's at least 7 to 8% of India's population, if not more. And if you do not involve people with disabilities on the decision-making table, you will not only come up with bad policies, but how can the economy progress as well? We want to become a developed economy, is what everybody says, but how can we become a developed economy leaving so many people behind? When it comes to sensitization amongst the general public, I think there's a lack of common sense at times as well. I mean, I know of a person in Mumbai, she's a friend of mine, who was getting married and she had to go up to the first floor to just get a wedding registered. And it's afterwards that the chief commissioner for persons with disabilities passed this order that, if there's any government official who is on the first floor and the wheelchair user cannot go up to the first floor, you should shift down. I don't think you needed a legal order for this. There should be a common sense thing by any government officer instead of having somebody being carried up one floor when there is no lift in that sense. Last year, there was this one movie called Aak Michori that came out that completely lampooned people with disabilities by calling people who stammer at QE cassettes, people who had memory loss as Bulakkar Baap, night blindness was totally fictionalized, and actually had to take this movie to court. And the Supreme Court actually came out with guidelines portraying people with disabilities in movies. However, and I thought that this will hopefully improve the situation. Just last week, there's this comedian called Samir Rana who, on his YouTube channel, came out with this video where he's lampooning people with disabilities again, and people are laughing. There are 11 million views on a video which is laughing at people who are stammering, laughing at people who are limping, etc. And if people in this country are finding this entertaining and there are 11 million views, I don't think it is fair that you get to participate and celebrate in India's Paralympic victories as well, because you don't This is just a lack of empathy. This is lack of equal opportunity. And I don't really think this is the country that we really want to build.
All right, Mr. Malhotra, Ms. Prasad, thank you so much for joining us. I want to end this important discussion on a good note, or rather a good quote. Mr. Malhotra, I want you to listen. Everyone has a problem. The only difference is that mine's visible while others isn't. This was actually a quote by one of our guests, Nipun Malhotra. Thank you once again for taking out the time and joining us on this very important discussion.